What is the craziest thing you've witnessed in real life, but no one believes you? I almost hit a kangaroo hopping across the highway in southwestern Ontario. Went camping in the Kaigalagadi Transfrontier Park. On the Botswana side we did a nature trail, which means a trail of 4 nights in the wild, no camps or fences. One morning we were having coffee before breaking down camp when we noticed lion prints around our tents. The one tent had marks in the dust which looked like the male was so close that his mane rubbed against the tent. As we were discussing this, I noticed movement in the grass behind our tent. As we all turned to look, a lioness sat up and stared at us, less than 100 meters from us. As she turned to walk away, all around us 4 male lions also appeared in the long grass. Turns out they were stalking us, a party of 5 people. And when the lioness realized their cover was blown, they just got up and walked away. It was fucking scary. Their paw prints were the size of fucking dinner plates. And we still had 2 nights on the trail. Needless to say, we didn't get much sleep. I saw Mick Jagger driving a convertible with the license plate Jagger, summertime in Toronto. Several years ago. Was in the passing lane. He was in the middle lane. I did a double take. He noticed, smiled and threw me the peace sign. Husband doesn't believe me. I saw a Tasmanian tiger in Australia. They've been extinct for many years. So did my next door neighbor in the Blue Mountains. It was dusk. He said, "Did you see it too?" No one will believe us. And no one did. No longer live in Australia. But it's a wild place. My parents were once burgled. And then everything returned a few days later in a box with an apology note. The 3 of us are still perplexed 30 years later. Went outside around 9 p.m. one night in dark to walk home from my neighbor's house. I saw a huge black jungle cat about 20 feet away from me. I hustled inside. Find out the next day in the newspaper that the circus in town had a black panther escape the night before. Edit #1. I was about 9 to 10 years old. My neighbor was my grandmother. The black jungle cat was in a hedge row woodline about 20 feet away. I had nightmares and dreams about it for years, how scared I was. My parents didn't believe me when I told them until they saw it in the newspaper. I was scared to go outside at night for years after. I grew up near a correctional facility in the middle of a nowhere town, so street lamps were very far apart. We had one light off our porch. One night my sister and I were outside just sitting and chatting. We saw someone walk past with what appeared to be a jumpsuit on, light in color and reflective writing on the back. Within 5 to 10 minutes a single cop drove down our street and searching the wooded areas with spotlights. Never anything on the news or anything communicated about an escaped prisoner, nor did the cops stop to chat or ask if we saw anything. So, this one is not violent or action-packed, just surreal. Back in the day, I had relatives who owned a funeral home. This one weekend, we were in town visiting other members of the family, and Dad gets up in the morning and says to me, "Let's go over to the funeral home and wash the car." They had a large garage attached for the hearses, cleaning them, etc. So we get to the funeral home. My relatives are there already. Open the garage doors and get ready to clean the car. That's when I notice the stretcher in the corner. So I ask, what's going on over there? My uncle says, "Oh, that's Mrs. Murphy. She passed late last night. We're at capacity right now. So as soon as there's space inside, we'll move her in." Okay, so, fair enough. These things happen. So we get the materials and start cleaning the car. Right about then, a Jeep pulls into the parking lot, which was odd, because it was kind of early on a Sunday morning. This guy gets out, opens up the back, pulls out a unicycle, and bowling pins. He proceeds to ride his unicycle around the parking lot, all the while juggling bowling pins. I watch this for a minute or two, turn to my father and say, "Doesn't he strike you a bit odd that we're cleaning the car in a garage with a dead body in the corner, while a guy on a unicycle is riding around the parking lot juggling bowling pins?" He stops, kind of pauses and says, "You know, it is a bit odd, isn't it?" I still think that was a rather large understatement. I stroked a bird when I was a kid, about 6 or so, and it fluffed into my hand for a minute and it's the most Disney princess fucking thing that ever happened to me. We were on holiday in some camp and it hopped onto a miniature rose bush and I went up and we just hung out and vibed for a solid minute or so with the pets. My mom was the only one who saw it, but no one ever believed her either. One year on our camping trip, my friends went to go on a beer run approximately 45 away while I took a nap in the tent. When I woke up it was 4 hours later and almost completely dark. My friends had gotten lost. I would find out later. We had taken psychedelics that morning, so it was understandable. Anyways, I get out of the tent to join the group of families we go camping with around the fire. And I kind of see this huge dark blob in front of me, but chose to ignore it, pretend I didn't see it. I was half convinced it was the psychedelics anyways. I take a few steps and then hear thud thud and the ground shook a bit. So clearly the blob was real, alive, and absolutely massive. The fact that it was spooked at my sudden appearance, and, given where I was, figured it was probably a huge black bear. At this point the best thing I could think to do, apparently, was to continue to pretend it was not there. So I went over to the fire and just stood there, keeping an eye on it. It then started to move closer to the fire, where there were about 30 people of all ages. No one sees the bear. It kept moving closer, so eventually I just said, "Hey everyone. Unfortunately, there is a bear right over there." No one believed me for about 5 seconds. Then I was just LKE, "It's literally right there GE," and pandemonium ensued. Parents screaming, banging pots and pans, chaos. The bear ran away almost immediately, but yeah, it was very large. My friends got back and they also didn't believe me lol, until everyone else corroborated my story. I once watched a huge war between crows and seagulls just outside of my house. They were flying in a giant circular swell, which I've actually seen before, but they were clearly warring. There were calls for reinforcements, and a giant cloud of crows would come from far off. The seagulls were far less organized but clearly rallying forces from the bay. They would fly really close behind the opposite birds in crowds and force them to keep flying up until they got exhausted and landed on the road and parking lot across the street. There were multiple birds laying everywhere, dying or flapping around. Some of the crows were dive-bombing seagulls that tried to land. The gulls were less aggressive but would sort of split the crows with their numbers and would ball up into a big group in the swell, and it'd force the crows to disperse. Also, it seemed like the crows had different factions and were a little feisty with each other sometimes too. It happened all within maybe 20 minutes. The sky also opened up like it does before a storm, and seemed to end just as quickly, and all the birds gave up, and it seemed obvious the crows won because some hung around afterward to laugh in the parking lot. It felt like I just watched some epic war, 'cause so many birds came to this spot just to do this. Came inside, told my parents, and they shrugged it off, "Ike, whatever." I tried to get them to come outside to see the dead bodies. They just didn't seem to care. I grew up in the Pentecostal church. I saw exorcisms where the person would be crawling on the floor, growling, and speaking in a demonic voice. I'm an atheist now, so I don't believe in demons anymore. So I think it was just people with mental health problems. And maybe some were faking. But a lot of people don't believe exorcism NS still happen at all. At the time, I thought it was real. So it was pretty exciting. They tried to cast demons out of me too. But nothing happened. Boring. When I was a kid, I tossed 2 Star Wars figures into a corner while putting on my shoes, and Chewbacca completely disappeared. Didn't fall into a vent or into a shoe. It literally disappeared, never to be seen again. I had a crush on a coworker. I'd finally got brave and mentioned how much I liked her. Turns out she was into me too. We made plans for the following evening. And I went home feeling pretty happy. That night I dreamed that I was driving to her house. And it was so very vivid. The next day I picked her up from work and she wanted to go to her house to change and get ready. I told her I'd dreamed about it and she asked me to describe it. I did. And she was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. Turns out I had just described the route to her house, along with landmarks, stands of trees, a railroad bridge, a Y in the road, including the layout of the interior of the house, where the driveway was, the row of 5 huge cedars along the road out front. I had never been there, and had never even driven down that road that I'm aware of before she directed me there. To this day I have no explanation for it. To be clear, it wasn't exactly like the dream in reality, but it was close enough to be startling. I wish I had dreamed about how irredeemably awful the next 2 years would be because of her instead. Closing curly bracket. My first job was as a nursing assistant in a very expensive nursing home. Most of the residents were wealthy. There was a lady there who was stick-thin and only laid in bed or sat in the chair. She didn't do anything on her own. She was unable to speak and would only cry when I read her mail to her. Of note, she had the most amazing collection of the prettiest nightgowns I have ever seen. Pastel colors. Flowy. Multiple layers. Just beautiful. Designers like Christian Dior. One night one of our residents died and I was busy getting him ready for the funeral home to come get him. I walked into the hallway and there she was, in her beautiful nightie, standing in the middle of the hallway. I ran to her and told her it was time for bed. I guided her back to her bed and got her all comfy and worn. She never tried to get out of bed before or since. No one believed me that I found her in the hallway.